I wrote this essay and produced this video all in about 72 hours as the result of being angered by something which I was tired of seeing and had crossed my social media feed one too many times. Because of that fact, this video is basically a bit of a rant, but restructured to be an essay. If you don't want that, then here's your disclaimer. As always, I've tried to temper what I had to say a little bit, but only a little bit. So here's the story. When I saw this story come out of Worldcon Seattle involving an author panel where George R.R. Martin got asked this super specific question about how the next book in his A Song of Ice and Fire series would be finished, well, I had some thoughts. This clip had been passed around a bunch, but the person who asked the question seems like they might just genuinely be kind of a crazy person, which honestly tracks with the rest of this behavior, and I have zero intention of platforming anybody with those kinds of attention-seeking tendencies, even in passing. So instead, I'm going to settle for quoting some of the online media coverage of this. Here's an article by Chris McPherson for Collider. We all know that George R.R. Martin has taken too long to finish The Winds of Winter. Indeed, no one is more aware of that fact than Martin himself, which is why his consistency in making public appearances remains so commendable. However, Martin may be reconsidering these appearances following reports of appalling scenes at this weekend's Worldcon in Seattle. Martin, appearing on a panel alongside Brandon Sanderson, Robin Hobb, Rebecca Roanhorse, and Ryan Cahill, was said to be confronted during a question-and-answer session by a supposed fan of his work, who demanded to know when he would be handing The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring, the final novel in A Song of Ice and Fire, to another author like Sanderson, adding that Martin was probably going to die soon. I've seen the video of the question itself, and it is such nuclear-grade cringe that this paragraph honestly doesn't do it justice. But we're unfortunately going to have to move on because that's really all I wanted out of this soundbite. If we dive any deeper, this will be a very different kind of video. Moving on, I was fully prepared to pay this issue no more than an eye roll's worth of attention until I subsequently saw an article, another Collider piece, that got my goat, such that I slept on it overnight and woke up with the intention to say something about it, which is why we're here. That piece, by Collier Jennings, was titled "Fans Have a Point, George R.R. Martin Should Let This Acclaimed Fantasy Author Finish Winds of Winter Instead." My response? Bait used to be believable. I've been seeing some version of this pitch for a decade, at least. I will say that in fairness, Jennings does say that, quote, "this moment was a prime example of toxic fan culture, not to mention fan entitlement, and completely misses the fact that it takes time to write a novel," end quote. I would be remiss to omit that fact. We can all agree that this behavior was cringe. More on that later. No, my real objection is to what follows. Brandon Sanderson has an immense body of work under his name, especially in the realms of epic fantasy. The Mistborn books created an entire mythology to rival Game of Thrones, to the point where another of his book series, the Stormlight Archive, takes place in the same universe. The Reckoners takes place in a world where superpowers have emerged, yet the people wielding them have chosen to rule humanity rather than save it. The end result is an epic to rival The Boys or Invincible in terms of subversive superhero stories. In addition to his novels, Sanderson's also become famous for setting the distinction between hard magic and soft magic, influencing other writers to take the same approach to their projects. There's even a name for his approach: Sanderson's 3 Laws of Magic. Sanderson's biggest claim to fame is co-writing the final 3 novels in the Wheel of Time series with Robert Jordan. Following Jordan's passing, his widow, Harriet McDougal, personally picked Sanderson to complete the Wheel of Time. Given that Sanderson managed to write the final Wheel of Time novels in a way that fit Jordan's vision, it makes sense why Game of Thrones fans feel he could do the same for The Winds of Winter. Yet George R.R. Martin is still around, and has stated that he plans to finish The Winds of Winter at some point. Martin is also fairly protective of Game of Thrones to the point where David Benioff and D.B. Weiss only got the rights to the book series by answering one of his questions. Sanderson would probably have to go through a similar trial. Now, maybe Jennings secretly agrees with me, and this is just a very well-crafted Trojan horse, but regardless, it bears pointing out that these arguments are all basically covert arguments against Sanderson doing what Martin does. In the first place, the idea that Mistborn rivals A Song of Ice and Fire is laughable. I don't mean to be rude to Sanderson or his fans, but Martin is not merely a good writer because he can spin a lot of plates at once where character perspectives and names of people and places are concerned. He's a good writer at a technical level, in a way I don't think Sanderson replicates. He is, for lack of a better phrase, doing things that Sanderson doesn't seem interested in doing. That's not reducible to which ideas Sanderson prefers to focus on, as opposed to Martin, because there's a style gap. Writing is a craft. Remember when I said that this was an old discourse that I've been seeing for a decade? Some of you probably remember it in the exact same way, and posts like this on Reddit are a part of why. In this, Brandon Sanderson himself fields this question, and I'd like to look in on exactly what he said and what we can learn from it. The primary reason has to do with fundamental optimism versus pessimism. I write darkness into my books, but it is darkness as contrast to light, and there's always a spark of hope. George's works seem fundamentally pessimistic, which I don't say as a slam. One of my favorite short stories is Harrison Bergeron, which is also fundamentally pessimistic. Saying George's work is pessimistic doesn't mean that he is pessimistic, only that he creates a work of art that evokes emotion and discussion through pessimistic themes. It would be easy to look at this 9-year-old post and say, alright, pack it in everyone, Sanderson said he wouldn't do it. In fact, I think that response is perfectly fine. The man said no. But that's not the whole story, is it? Sanderson doesn't just see himself as a very different writer from Martin. He's correct to say that, and is even being a little reserved in his wording. I'd like to offer up a pair of passages for comparison here. The first is from Sanderson's work, specifically the ending of Mistborn, the first novel in the series of the same name. Endings are very deliberate acts for authors. The language here will be telling as to what style Sanderson is attempting to develop. Spoilers ahead in this video, by the way, for a bunch of Mistborn and A Song of Ice and Fire, so if spoilers bother you and you haven't read these, feel free to peace out. With all the chaos, she'd nearly forgotten the Inquisitor's words about Reen. Now, however, the memory made her pause. Mists passed by her, curling, coaxing. Reen hadn't abandoned her. He'd been captured by the Inquisitors who had been looking for Vin, the unlawful child of their enemy. They'd tortured him, and he had died protecting her. Reen didn't betray me. He always promised that he would, but in the end he didn't. He had been far from a perfect brother, but he had loved her nonetheless. A whispered voice came from the back of her mind, speaking in Reen's voice. Go back. Before she could convince herself otherwise, she dashed limpingly back to the broken skylight and dropped a coin to the floor below. Elend turned curiously, looking at the coin, cocking his head. Vin dropped down a second later, pushing herself up to slow the fall, landing only on her good leg. Elend Venture, she said, standing up, there is something I've been meaning to tell you for some time. She paused, blinking away her tears. You read too much, especially in the presence of ladies. He smiled, throwing back his chair and grabbing her in a firm embrace. Vin closed her eyes, simply feeling the warmth of being held, and realized that was all she had ever really wanted. This is pretty modern in its wording. Stylistically, you could get something pretty similar to this from a lot of writers in the past half of a century. I know it's not too dissimilar from some of the other stuff I've read for this channel, from young adult literature to the video game tie-ins that I've read for the Patreon, although I liked all of those better than Sanderson's work. Still, I wanted you all to get a feel for the way Sanderson uses words. Now let's look at a similar section where Martin chooses to end A Game of Thrones, the first book in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. The third crack was as loud and sharp as the breaking of the world. When the fire died at last and the ground became cool enough to walk upon, Ser Jorah Mormont found her amidst the ashes, surrounded by blackened logs and bits of glowing ember and the burnt bones of man and woman and stallion. She was naked, covered with soot, her clothes turned to ash, her beautiful hair all crisped away, yet she was unhurt. The cream and gold dragon was suckling at her left breast, the green and bronze at the right. Her arms cradled them close. The black and scarlet beast was draped across her shoulders, its long and sinuous neck coiled under her chin. When it saw Jorah, it raised its head and looked at him with eyes as red as coals. Wordless, the knight fell to his knees. The men of her cause came up behind him. Jogo was the first to lay his arak at her feet. Blood of my blood, he murmured, pushing his face to the smoking earth. Blood of my blood, she heard Aggo echo. Blood of my blood, Rakaro shouted. And after them came her handmaids, and then the others, all the Dothraki, men and women and children, and Dany had only to look at their eyes to know that they were hers now, today and tomorrow and forever, hers as they had never been Drogo's. As Daenerys Targaryen rose to her feet, her black hissed, pale smoke venting from its mouth and nostrils. The other two pulled away from her breasts and added their voices to the call, translucent wings unfolding and stirring in the air, and for the first time in hundreds of years, the night came alive with the music of dragons. You are not wrong, per se, if you like Sanderson's passage better or if you prefer him as a writer, but his work, in my experience, is far different stylistically from Martin's, and I consider that an objective fact. I'm going to use some language here that isn't intuitive, so please just allow me to explain what I mean when I say these things, and hopefully you'll get what I'm trying to say. Martin is a romantic, a dark romantic perhaps, as different from Tolkien as Edgar Allan Poe was from John Keats, but a romantic nonetheless, whereas Sanderson is decidedly not. Terms like these get used in other contexts as pejoratives and euphemisms, but in literature, they describe literary movements. There have been different waves and generations of these art movements, but the core attenuations of the artists are the utility of the terms. Martin describes the world in a manner which elevates and glorifies nature, especially death, but also trees, and focuses his narration around those things which penetrate the senses, especially music, food, and appearances. To write like Martin, you need to write like Martin. I want to do my best here to avoid tilting at Sanderson personally, but when discussing someone's life's work, you're talking about their baby, so I think there's a basic concession that needs to be made here. Sanderson seems like a nice dude. I do not, however, personally believe he is all that where writing is concerned. There are a couple of reasons for this, but I need to say that he is not personally a bad writer. He's just very overrated in my mind. For years and years, I've heard tons of people talk about how great this guy is, so finding him only okay feels a little annoying in light of conversations like these. And there's other stuff I personally don't like about Sanderson's work that I think makes it different from Martin's. This is the next paragraph from that same Reddit post. My work is also fundamentally different from George's in our use of magic. We've talked about books, and he points out rightly that I often use a heavily magical component in my stories, particularly the endings. This is because I'm writing science-magic hybrids, and the idea of magic as progress is fascinating to me. George, however, prefers his magic to be arcane, unknown, and dark, not a tool, but a force you can sometimes, with great danger, apply. This is a small issue, as I'm fond of books that use magic differently. I've just made a stylistic choice in how I do what I do. If I had to put him into words without really knowing what other people call him, I'd have to say that his work at certain times reads to me as equally cynical and dystopian as Martin's. He attends to injustice and personal character flaws pretty strongly. He would probably not see this as the case, given his earlier account of optimism and pessimism, but that kind of bugs me, because it makes it sound like what Sanderson sees as the presence of light despite darkness requires some kind of epistemic victory, rather in the way that Christians engaging with fiction will sometimes not think of a story as being a Christian story if it does not in some way affirm that their Christian doctrine is somehow good or true. The characters in Martin's world are not reassured that they are in the right, regardless of how much they suffer and toil. There's no narration at any point which affirms that Jon Snow is a good guy despite his insecurities. It is left to the reader to make that determination given Jon's point of view. Another word I would use to describe limited parts of the Mistborn books might be devotional, especially the ending. I mean this in the sense that there's a specific kind of awe of the divine, as opposed to awe towards nature, which Martin exhibits strongly, that exists in Mistborn despite Sanderson's characterization of magic as being a sort of rules-based scientific system. I don't like that kind of stuff, but it is undoubtedly Sanderson's personal territory. Sanderson talked about himself in that post like he was seeing silver linings, like he was looking at the good in the midst of the bad, finding the holy among the impure. I think the way the Mistborn books turn out, speaking to the trilogy specifically, really says something about someone who sees it as this beautiful, redeeming story of light out of darkness. I can, at a minimum, see how a Mormon could write some of this stuff. It fits. Maybe I'm being a bit too gentle to a guy who self-admittedly believes in his own religion because he's rationalizing his assessment of the truth value of its claims by appraising the outcomes in the lives of its adherents, also a core tenet of the so-called Protestant prosperity gospel, some viewers may note. But either way, I really loathe the way Sanderson both talks and writes about religious experience to my very core, whereas Martin seems to have grabbed hold of something that I find very beautiful. I think even if we engage with these two writers on their merits, they would not be good fits for each other. If you like Brandon Sanderson's books, you'd probably be disappointed in how Martin would do them, and I know I would not be satisfied in Sanderson doing A Song of Ice and Fire. It wouldn't work. It would not be good. And since when is getting something that doesn't work and is bad better than nothing? I remember when George Lucas talked about not making the Star Wars sequels, he described his reasoning on the terms of the time he had left in his life and how he wanted to use it. And so instead, we got the J.J. Abrams sequel trilogy, and it feels like every time I see people talking about those films, there's some kind of dissatisfaction. Have we not learned our lesson here? Let's return to George R.R. Martin's blog for some final thoughts. Back in May, there was a quick note in one of his posts, which was about something else entirely, that went as follows. I know. Some of you will just be pissed off by this, as you are by everything I announce here that is not about Westeros or the Winds of Winter. You have given up on me or on the book. I will never finish Winds. If I do, I will never finish A Dream of Spring. If I do, it won't be any good. I ought to get some other writer to pinch hit for me. I am going to die soon anyway because I am so old. I lost all interest in A Song of Ice and Fire decades ago. I don't give a shit about writing any longer. I just sit around and spend my money. I edit the Wild Cards books too, but you hate Wild Cards. You may hate everything else I've ever written, the Hugo winners and Hugo losers, A Song for Laia and Dying of the Light, Sand Kings and Beauty and the Beast, This Tower of Ashes, The Stone City, Old Mars and Old Venus and Rogues and Warriors and Dangerous Women, and all the other anthologies I edited with my friend Gardner Dozois. You don't care about any of those, I know. You don't care about anything but Winds of Winter. You've told me it so often enough. Thing is, I do care about them. And I care about Westeros and Winds as well. The Starks and Lannisters and Targaryens, Tyrion and Asha, Dany and Daenerys, the dragons and the direwolves. I care about them all. More than you can ever imagine. Every time I see someone say something behind their anonymous account like, this author, director, developer owes their fans more / better, I just picture a middle-aged woman calling for a manager and claiming her coupon should still be good. Of course, a not insignificant portion of these people on the internet are actually angry or spiteful men, but the comparison, I think, holds up. Martin does not owe us anything more than what we already got. It's disappointing that we might never see the end of this story, but it's also how life happens. You are not being failed or having anything taken from you when an author does not finish a story. Buying a book is not a multiple decades-long investment. That sensation you're experiencing is called hope, and it does not give you the right to mistreat other people purely by virtue of your role as a consumer of goods. Despite what I've seen in some comment sections, this convention-goer did not, in fact, have a good point. This was Karen behavior. Art connects people. It draws people together. You're not merely consuming a product when you engage with art, even when it's being conveyed via a market, via a corporation, and advertising. It's far bigger than that, in my opinion. You're participating in a human tradition, so to see this obsession with consuming when people are mad that they're not getting something, or the alternative rhetoric about good little consumers when people are just enjoying things, has truly disgusted me far more than anything else. I don't just want any A Song of Ice and Fire books, I want the ones that are written by George R.R. Martin, and I will always want more of them, no matter how many I get. Given that, even if A Dance with Dragons was the last in the series, I would still be as happy as ever. I want Martin to continue working on what he feels like he has to work on, and while he's at it, I want something else as well. Martin hit on what that is over on that same blog in another different post. It's been months since Paris and I last went to the movies, but we finally got out of the house last week and bopped down to the Violet Crown to catch Superman. I'm glad we did. Soups and I are old friends, and this is one of the best Superman movies in a long time. Maybe ever. This new Superman reminds me of the version I used to read about when I was a kid, the strange visitor from another planet who came to Earth with powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. And yes, an innocent. Of course he's always been an immigrant, and an illegal immigrant when you stop to think of it. The film looks great, and James Gunn did a great job with the casting. Rachel Brosnahan was terrific as Lois Lane. I'd say it's between her and Margot Kidder for best Lois ever. And there's no doubt whatsoever for the best Lex. Nicholas Hoult was far and away the best Luthor of all time, a truly chilling villain. The Kid in the Cape was excellent as well. I hope he gets to play Kal-El in another dozen movies. There's been some great SF on television as well. The Murderbot stories are always a lot of fun, and the TV show did them justice. I look forward to another series. Andor was this year's highlight, though. far and away the best of the Star Wars spin-offs, looked gorgeous. Diego Luna was first-rate, and there was a realism and tension to the story that was sadly lacking in most of the other spin-offs. It's nice to see someone doing science fiction right. What I want more than anything else, is to be able to keep reading and keep writing. And I want that for other people too. We don't need someone to come in and finish George R.R. Martin's work for him if he doesn't. What we need is more George R.R. Martins, and that's going to require a lot of things. It's going to require a society that knows how to treat its writers righteously. It's going to require education to keep people reading and writing and doing both competently. It's going to require an economy that doesn't exploit the hell out of people such that writing is less tenable for writers and less attractive for non-writers. And it's going to require each and every one of us in our passion and our perseverance. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you watching me. Check out my channel and my Patreon for other ways to support what I do. And good luck out there.